Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. Hey guys, it's Scott Groves with the On the Edge podcast with another round of Scott's Thoughts. Just kind of three stories to go over that are sticking out to me in the kind of news media or the social media zeitgeist or the political arena. And for context, we are recording this towards the end of June in 2021. And also for context, I am not wearing a beanie to try to look super cool like Tim Pool, nor does it make sense to be wearing a beanie because it's currently 110 degrees out here in Santa Clarita, California, where we're filming this, soon to be building another podcast studio in Las Vegas, Nevada. So pretty excited about that. However, I am wearing a beanie because I just got my ear drained. I've been really into jiu-jitsu this last year and a half throughout the pandemic and got my ear smashed pretty hard, and it filled up with blood, and it was pretty disgusting. But to make sure that you don't get cauliflower ear, which is that really weird hardened ball sack attached to the side of your ear, I got it drained by my coach, and so I got it drained, and now I've got some magnets on it to kind of compress it so it doesn't fill back up with blood. And then to make sure my floppy ear doesn't start to come down because I got big ears, you got to put then a beanie on to hold the magnets in place. So it's a big mess, and we'll probably have to take a break so I can adjust the magnets because it does not feel good to have two magnets pinching against your ear. But I guess that's better than having like a big ball sack on the side of your earlobe. But anyway, I digress. What stories are we talking about today? First of all, and it pains me to hate Airbnb so much because I love Airbnb so much. I use Airbnb. Like I mentioned, we just bought a house up in Henderson, Las Vegas. So we will probably be back and forth quite a bit between Southern California and Vegas. And when we're out of town, it's likely we will use Airbnb to rent our house, either here in LA or up in Las Vegas. And I think the service is amazing. And I think their interface is great. And I think so much about what they do and the product that they offer consumers is amazing. But as a company, I really could not hate them more. And there's some historical context here, right? So if we go back, you should Google this, Chris. When did Airbnb start? I think it was probably about 12 years ago. They first started getting like real critical mass on their product, right? And for those of you that don't know, it started in San Francisco. A guy thought it'd be cool to put up a listing on like a Craigslist type thing to rent out his couch because there was a conference in town and all the hotels were booked. And that kind of started Airbnb, and he came up with a great thought.
August 08
it started. Yeah, so 12 years ago is when I would have first heard about them, about a year after they started. So again, I think it's a great idea. But let's not forget that many companies like Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, the online poker industry, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to get either venture or capital money in their seed phase, or they're trying to grow to critical mass where everybody overlooks the fact that they're basically breaking the law, right? So whether you consider Uber a ride sharing platform where you're just asking your fellow neighbor for a ride, or whether you consider it to be what it really is, which is a taxi service, there's certain laws in place to regulate the taxi service, right? There's certain laws in place to regulate short-term rentals, AKA hotels. And what Airbnb did and the online poker industry did and Uber did is they basically just said, we're not going to follow the laws for the first 3, 4, 5, 10 years that they're in existence. We're going to use venture capital money, which is not regulated, to try to grow our business big enough to where we become part of the society or part of the fabric of society. We become so big and so valuable and or have so much money and political influence that we can then shift our business model at some point down the road from breaking the law to either getting the laws changed or loosely changing the laws. Now, I kind of love that, right? The libertarian in me wants free market capitalism, and I want there to be lower and lower barriers to entry to new business startups, and the regulations and the hotel fees and the, what do they call them in Vegas when you get that little additional fee? Oh, resort fee, right? The resort fee, yeah. All these little resort fees, these are all really just taxes in the system. And I'm not a big fan of taxes, obviously. So I like the ethos of an Airbnb or an Uber or online poker. There's several other businesses that have like really skirted the law until they get big enough to where they can then affect change, or they're just big enough to where they can keep breaking the law and nobody really messes with them. However, what's coming out of Airbnb right now is they've kind of lost that avant-garde spirit, right? That capitalistic spirit that started them and launched them. And now they just have to kiss up to whatever woke mob or local politician or federal politician, because now there's real money at stake, right? Airbnb is a publicly traded company, right? They went public, Chris, I think a year ago or 2 years ago. What's the market cap of Airbnb?
The market cap or
Yeah.
the current stock price?
Well, you look up the stock price and then you multiply that by all the shares. So you can look up the current market cap. What's the valuation of Airbnb? I would be fascinated.
It just says stock price 152.52, and then revenue 3.378 billion.
Look up, just Google market cap of Airbnb, because I want to see that. Because see, now that there's real money at stake, right? They have to have their PR people, and they got to pretend like they want to follow the laws, and they have to respond to the super woke mobs. And so there's this story coming out, I found in the Boston Globe, but it's kind of proliferated throughout the internet, that Airbnb says it plans to prevent landlords from profiting off of pandemic evictions. So, not to bore you with the technicalities of the article, but basically Airbnb says, well, we're going to partner with local municipalities, counties, the housing administration, like local housing administrations, and we're not going to allow these evil landlords who evict their tenants because of the fact that they haven't been paying their rent during COVID. We're not going to allow them profit. We're not going to allow them to then profit off of this service of Airbnb because we're so righteous and we want to be part of the community. And it's like, you assholes started your business by blatantly breaking the law, then skirting the law, then not abiding by the same laws, fees, restrictions, zonings, and taxes that hotels had to. Like, you basically used your tech influence and your power through the money that you got from venture capitals to completely ignore the law for years, almost a decade, to grow yourself into what you are. But now that we're super big and we want to be super righteous, we're not going to allow these evil landlords who, of course, are just sitting on a pile of money and counting their gold coins. We're not going to allow them to use our service to make money if they have to evict people. So this was interesting because I ended up going deeper into the LA County temporary housing ban, right? And obviously it's been different throughout the country. There's some federal moratoriums on evictions. There's all kinds of interrelated housing policy from the federal government all the way down to your lowest municipality. But I'm like, hey, let me just start with LA County because that's what I'm most familiar with. So I dove into the LA County website because for those of you that aren't landlords or aren't familiar with kind of how this has worked, since I think it was effective March 4th of 2020, they basically, at least here in LA County and in many other counties around the country, they put a moratorium on evictions. So they basically told landlords, and let's be clear, over 70% of landlords in America either own a single rental property or they're property owners who have basically invested their entire life savings, net worth, profit through their career over the course of their life into rental properties so that it can sustain them during their retirement years, right? So this idea that landlords are some evil Uncle Scrooge or some evil giant faceless corporation that's just taking advantage of the poor, unfortunate souls, which are renters. This is not the reality, right? It's over 70% of landlords in America either own a single rental unit, which helps supplement their income, or they own many rental units, might be 2,000, but that's the sole source or the primary source of their retirement income. So I digress. So March 4th of last year, 2020, as this COVID thing hit, and then through about June 30th, there was one set of laws in Los Angeles County. And then after June 30th it was March 4th of 2020 until October, there was one set of laws. And then they kind of codified this and solidified a policy and a new bill through our county board of supervisors. And that followed or ends here in June 30th. Again, we're filming this at the end of June 2021. And so we're a couple days away from this moratorium ending, right? So think about this for a moment. You are a landlord and maybe you count on your rent, like most of us that own rental properties, you count on your rent to pay your mortgage and pay your taxes and maybe pay the utilities if you have a situation worked out where rents cover utilities. Or maybe you use that money to invest in other areas of your life that are really important. Or maybe you use that net rental income to pay other expenses in your life, right? For some retirement people, they use their rental income to eat and pay the mortgage on their house and do all the things that they have to do. And the county of Los Angeles just came in and said, well, here's the deal. Because of COVID, and we don't really know who's losing their job or who we're not letting go to work. And let's be clear, it was the county of Los Angeles and the state of California that created the problem, right? Because the reason you probably can't pay your rent is because you can't go to work. And if the state of California, the county of Los Angeles, has told you can't go to work, right? They create this problem, then they have to create another problem that they think is a solution, and then another problem, then they create more problems, then they come back to us and they say, oh, well, we've got the solution, but that creates more problems. It's just crazy. Anyway, I digress. I could go down a whole rabbit hole there. Actually, let's go down that rabbit hole real quick. So I do home loans. That's my primary source of income in my business. A lot of my referrals for home loans come from realtors. The government is the only entity in the world that can go create a problem and then trick you into thinking that somehow they are the only ones with the solution. So the analogy that I like to give to some of my more progressive realtor friends is just imagine if I, Scott, the loan officer, came to you and said, hey, I really need you to give me your loan referrals, your clients that are going to buy houses. I would like to be referred as their loan officer, and I'll do the loan. And then time and time again, I just kept screwing up the loan. I couldn't close the loan closed late. The loan could never close because there was problems with the way that I was doing the income calculations. I had bad bedside manner with the client. My poor results in the loan space got you, the realtor, to not get referrals, or it created a situation where like these clients never wanted to work with you again because you referred me, the loan officer. What if that was happening? And then I kept coming back to you and saying, but you know what the only solution is here is for you to refer me more loans. That's basically how the government operates. They shut down the state. They shut down the counties. They send people home and they say, well, you can't work. You can't earn money. And the unemployment we're giving you is probably not enough to fully supplement your income. So we have a huge problem. But don't worry, even though we created the problem, we're going to be your sole solution. We'll just go ahead and make it to where landlords cannot evict you from your property for not paying your rent. So we've got you covered for the next year. But guess what? That creates a whole nother issue of cascading problems, because now you have another group of people, which are the landlords, who they cannot pay their bills or their mortgages, right? So then the county has to come out and say, well, now we've got two problems we've created, but don't worry, we're the only source of the solution. So we're going to create a reserve fund for landlords to petition us to get money from the county to help you pay your mortgage and your bills if you were affected by these people that can't pay their rent because we told them they couldn't work, right? Well, guess what's happening now? Now, because the county has spent so much money, they're like, well, maybe we should raise property taxes to pay for that fund that we gave to landlords because they couldn't collect their rents or evict the tenants, because we created a situation where the people can't work. Do you just see how this just keeps going and going and going? And government is usually the problem and rarely the solution. So back to this. Sorry about the rabbit hole we had to go down there. So the LA County created this temporary eviction moratorium, and they said from March 4th of 2020 until June 30th of 2021, you, the landlord, cannot evict somebody for not paying their rent if they text you and say, hey, I'm having financial hardship because of COVID-19. That's all they have to do. They don't have to fill out a form. They don't have to show you proof of pay stubs. They don't have to have their credit report run. They don't have to have somebody do a forensic review of their bank statements to see if they could still pay their rent. All they have to do is provide their landlord with a letter, an email, or a text message that says, hey, I'm having financial hardship because of COVID. I will not be paying my rent. So I dug deeper into this, frequently asked questions, and this kind of outlines the stuff on the bill, right? This is basically a no-fault situation where if for any reason you, the tenant, cannot pay or says that you cannot pay your rent, you just let your landlord know. And from March of last year until June of this year, so March, April, May, June, for 16 months, tenants have created a situation or been presented a situation where they don't have to pay their rent. That's crazy. And then it says here in the fine print of this, and this actually just made me laugh. This made me laugh real hard. It says, does this mean tenants don't need to pay their rent? Okay. So think about this. So you're a tenant and the county comes out and says, well, your landlord can no longer evict you. And you say, well, does that mean that I don't have to pay my rent? And this is what the county of Los Angeles says. It's just so absolutely stupid. The county of Los Angeles says, no, the county moratorium is not a cancellation of unpaid rents during the moratorium. Tenants will have until September 30th, 2021 to repay past due rent occurred between March of 2020 and September of 2020. For past due rent occurred between October 1st, 2020 and June 30th, 2021, because there were two different guidelines that were controlling these kind of two different time periods during COVID. Tenants must follow the directives under California Assembly Bill, yada, 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 yada. Tenants are encouraged to pay partial rent during the moratorium if they are able to do so. So they're not saying, this is just such legal, political double talk. Do I have to pay my rent? No. You should pay your rent. But if you don't pay your rent, your landlord can't evict you. It's like, okay, well, let me read further. And then it says tenants are encouraged to pay partial rent. Doesn't say they're full rent. Just, pay what you can whenever you can. And work out a payment plan with the landlord during and after the termination of the moratorium. And this is the part that just really kicks anybody who's ever been a property owner in LA in the ass. It says, however, a residential tenant may not be evicted for failure to pay back unpaid rents under the term of a payment plan. So let me tell you how this works in practice, because I have a friend that owns a 3-unit property that's going through this, that he actually purchased right before COVID. So he has these 3 tenants in 3 different units. COVID hits, and, to the best of his knowledge, because he ran these people's credits, he saw their bank statements, he saw what type of jobs they had when they rented the property, because you're allowed to do all that research when you're renting to a tenant. To the best of his knowledge, he has 3 tenants that have excellent credit, have assets, and based on what he remembers from the original outset, have jobs where they're probably still earning a decent living, meaning they have more white collar jobs where they can work from Zoom. They're probably not as financially devastated from COVID-19, meaning he's not renting to a bunch of waiters who, by no fault of their own, were told that they couldn't work for 6 months, right? So these are people that presumably should still be able to pay their rent. But like any good, I was going to use a bad word there, I won't. Like any good group of people who kind of have their own self-interest at heart, which many of us do. I'm trying to see how I can say this without being really obnoxious and rude. But we'll just say these 3 people banded together and basically all contacted their landlord at the same time and said, hey, COVID, we're not really required to pay our rent, although we're supposed to pay our rent, but you can't evict us. Who knows how long this is going on? Would you take some reduced rent? And it wasn't really a question. It was a threat, because the threat was, hey, landlord, you can take reduced rent. And if you don't agree to do reduced rent, we just won't pay our rent because, you can't evict us, right? And so he took the reduced rent, and he has a repayment plan, meaning like, all right, I reduced your rent by X, but you have to pay me back over time once this COVID-19 eviction moratorium is up and we kind of return to normal. However, in the fine print of this bill that California passed, if they decide never to abide by the terms of that repayment plan, he cannot evict them for the fact that they're not paying the enhanced, more expensive rent if it was part of a repayment plan that occurred because they had reduced rent during COVID-19. So what's the real outcome here? Because again, we have all this political double talk, and luckily the business I work in the mortgage and real estate industry, I'm talking to people that have firsthand experience in this. The real situation is on June 30th, when you can evict people, there will probably be a mass eviction situation in the county of Los Angeles, because again, you have landlords going back to March of last year. If you had savvy tenants who knew how to play the game or had real financial hardship, they were put in a situation by the county of Los Angeles and many other counties around the country where they didn't have to pay their rent, right? So now, if you think either you're the type of person that's willing to game the system, or you're the type of person that had true financial hardship and your income was devastated over the last year, what are the chances after not paying rent for 16 months that you have it in your budget or in your psyche to go back to paying normal rent, much less enhanced rent that's going to help you catch up for the shortage or the non-payment of rent over the previous 16 months. So what's really going to happen is landlords are going to serve eviction notices. In the county of Los Angeles, it is like pulling teeth to go through the legal rigmarole of evicting people. What most people do when they need to evict a tenant is they wave a cashier's check in front of their face, the tenant's face, and say, hey, I'm willing to give you $2,000, $3,000, $10,000 cash for keys in order for you to get out. So here's the cashier's check made out to you. I need all your shit out of the house. And when you hand me over the keys peacefully and the house isn't destroyed, I will hand you this cashier's check for $2,000, $3,000, $10,000, whatever the case may be, because the landlord knows they're going to lose at least that month, at least that much going through the 30-day, 3-month, 1-year process of evicting a tenant. So what's going to end up happening is on June 30th, there's going to be a bunch of eviction notices served. The county of Los Angeles, realizing that some X percent, because it's been estimated something like 13 to 17% of tenants in Los Angeles County are either not paying their rent or on some type of reduced rent that they're likely not going to be able to make up after this June 30th eviction moratorium is up. So I presume, and let's keep an eye on this, Chris, maybe we should set a calendar reminder. I presume somewhere after the 4th of July holiday, LA County is going to come out and say, oh shit, we created this problem, that created this problem, that created this problem. Again, we're government. We clearly have the only solutions. We can't let the free market take care of it. So let's create another assembly bill, or let's create another moratorium, or let's create another fund of money to help the people that are affected by the thing, which they're really affected by government. But there will be some other patchwork, Band-Aid, horrible policy, and it will just be a nightmare, right? And the landlords will basically just give up because they know if these people are really facing a hardship or they're the type of people that know how to use the system, they don't want to take them to small courts for $5,000 or small claims court for $5,000. They don't want to pay a lawyer and throw more good money after bad in order to recoup the loss. There's just a lot of landlords that are just going to have to write off the last year and a half and be like, oh, well, I got screwed by the system and or the tenant and or COVID-19. It is what it is. And, you know, I don't really mind that so much because going back to my very original point here, when there's social dilemmas like a pandemic, although my opinion is local, state, federal government made the pain, the financial pain, I mean, way worse than it needed to be. But when there is some type of social dilemma, there is this theory that like debt or exposure or painful hits to your income, there is this idea that it kind of trickles upstream, right? Meaning that like bad debt or financial hardship gets passed from weaker to stronger, right? So renters, maybe they can't afford something, and so the landlord absorbs it. And eventually the landlord can absorb it, so their financial advisors absorb it. And then eventually somewhere the biggest entity is the government. They end up absorbing it, right? It's this debt and it's this pain and it's this financial hardship that kind of gets passed from lower tiers of socioeconomic people all the way up to higher, and then eventually all the way up to the government. We saw that after the banking crisis of 2009. However, fuck Airbnb, because what they're saying is, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Landlord, you kind of got screwed by insert whatever your personal opinion or political opinion justifies, right? You can say they got screwed by COVID-19 and that was unforeseen. You can say they got screwed by bad government policy, which is kind of where I always go. You can say they got screwed by a good-hearted or a evil-hearted tenant who either couldn't pay their rent or chose to game the system to not pay their rent. You can assign blame wherever you want. But for Airbnb to say, well, landlord, you got screwed, and now it's legally within your rights to evict people on June 30th. And if you decide to do that, we're not going to let you make money. We're not going to help you solve the problem and catch up with some of your income by using Airbnb because we're so virtuous and we're so righteous that no, we're just not going to let you do that because we know better than you, the evil landlord class of people who we count on for our business that used to be illegal. we don't really believe in what you're doing, which is just crazy to me. The hypocrisy from Airbnb just blows my fucking mind. And I could talk all day long about policy I disagree with the county of Los Angeles. I could talk all day long about anecdotal stories I've heard where tenants very well could be paying their rent and take care of it. And all that stuff is going to happen in a complex financial society like the one that we live in. But Airbnb, again, who built their business on the back of breaking city, county, state, and federal laws, and then skirted the system until they became, Chris looked it up, a $94 billion company. And now, even when landlords are going to follow the law and legally evict people on June 30th, they're just coming in and saying, nope, we're so woke, we're so virtuous, we're not going to let you use our service to make money. And so what I hope is all the landlords out there who have used Airbnb in the past, or maybe they have some long-term rentals and some short-term rentals, don't use them, right? If they're not going to support you in your time of need when you're legally getting tenants out and you have to recoup some of this money as quick as possible by putting your property on a short-term rental, if they're not going to support you, don't support their bottom line. Go to VRBO or find an old school management company, or, there's plenty of competitors to Airbnb, because I cannot believe, especially with the method in which they built their business, that this is their response to landlords who are in need. All right, next story. There's this interesting story developing where Venezuela, and by the way, if you haven't looked into Venezuela, it's interesting. It's very interesting because it was like less than 10 years ago that Sean Penn, Bernie Sanders. Oh, who's the director that did the movies about Hugo Chavez? Chris, can you look that up? Oliver Stone. There you go. Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone didn't just do one. He did 2 documentaries on Hugo Chavez and how Venezuela was the new model for socialism, and how they were investing their natural resources and their government resources and the oil money that they received back into the economy and back into the people and back into social programs. And unless you've been living under a rock, Venezuela is effectively a failed state. And you can do a lot of reading on this. We'll actually link to a couple of YouTube videos that have like good 20 to 30 minute explanations about what went wrong with Venezuela. But the 60-second Reader's Digest that you need to know about is that Venezuela, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Iraq, more than the entire United States, even though it's a much smaller country than the United States, has more oil reserve in their ground than any other country in the world. Like, Venezuela should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But what they did is, as the price of oil climbed over the last couple of decades, they made it a requirement that X amount of dollars per barrel of oil sold went back into the government, went back into social programs. And so what you ended up having is the oil industry, the effectively government-run oil industry, although there were some private entities in there, government-run oil industries, or this crony capitalism where they were kind of private companies, but they're really run by the government. As they're pulling oil out of the ground and the country is getting rich, they're diverting more and more of the profits, or more and more of the income from this oil sale, into social programs, right? And they're basically getting their entire society addicted to more and more and more free programs and socialist programs and free this and free that. And then, not surprisingly, because oil is a commodity and all commodities go up and down in value, when the price of oil drops, and it didn't even have to drop significantly. It's not like it had to crash. It just had to go down $10, $20 a barrel in oil. They quickly get into a situation where the government has mandated X amount of dollars per barrel have to come to the government or through the government for some type of social program. And now there's no money left over for like profit, or actually the workers who are taking the money out, or the oil out of the ground. And so what we end up having is Venezuela is effectively a failed state, because it's gotten to the point where they can't even legally pump oil out of the ground at a price, or they can't sell the oil they pump out of the ground at a price high enough to pay for all the government required social programs. And so there's this really weird situation where Venezuela is importing oil from Iran, because Iran's basically given them this favored nation status for other political reasons, and Iran trying to influence some country on the Americas, or in the American continents. So Iran's bringing in oil to Venezuela, which is the most oil-rich country in the world. It's very, very weird. And unfortunately, the people that are suffering are the people of Venezuela, right? Like they got tricked. They got addicted to so many social programs and so much government spending that when that stopped, there was no other real private enterprise left in Venezuela. And there's just horrific stories of people like crossing the border just to try to bring toilet paper back illegally, and massive amount of citizens eating out of dumpsters and killing their dogs and cats for meat. And I think, Chris, maybe you can fact check this real quick. I think in the last 3 years, the average Venezuelan has lost something like 15 to 25 pounds because of malnutrition. And Venezuela apparently was not a morbidly obese country like America. So a lot of these people don't have weight to lose. But yeah, I think there's some stat that like the average Venezuelan has lost 15 pounds in the last year or 25 pounds in the last 3 years because there's just not enough food and nutrition in the country. What'd you find, Chris?
Child malnutrition rates increased by 26%, while general undernutrition rates increased by 21.2%.
Yeah, it's not good. Especially in a world economy where like one of our biggest problems in the world is obesity. Like for the first time in human history, we have such an abundance of food and such an abundance of cheap food. For a country to not even be able to feed its children, everything else has gone off the rails. But what's interesting is the U.S. was monitoring this Iranian warship that was maybe headed to Venezuela. And I've read a bunch about this story. And apparently there's this oil tanker that's been refitted as a Iranian kind of forward operating base. And for any of you that have been in the military, sometimes they call it the TOC, sometimes they call it the forward operating base for the AO, the area of operation. Sometimes it's like a big tank, where like all the commanders sit with their maps and their radios and they command the battlefield. Sometimes it's something bigger and more exotic. Sometimes it's a little traveling town. Sometimes like in Iraq or Afghanistan, it becomes a whole base that's actually built out. And sometimes it's, think battleships, right? It's this big ship where like everything is commanded and controlled from. And so Iran has one of these ships that basically houses special forces and advanced technology and radio. That's what they're presuming, obviously, because the U.S. has not seen the inside of the ship. So there was this Iranian frigate called the Mcconaughey, which is a former oil tanker that was converted into a floating forward staging base and was headed along the East Africa coast. They caught its trajectory on the ocean a couple times. It was headed to Venezuela. And then apparently behind the scenes, the U.S. started putting pressure on this. So it kind of like regained its original course, kind of just floating along the coast of Africa. And I bring this up not because I have anything really interesting to say about it, but it's interesting how this story has been developing, not really talked about in the news between when I first read this original story, which came out June 30th. Again, it's now June. What's the date today? June 21st? 19th, June 19th. So this will come out in about a week, again, towards the end of June. And then this most recent story is from today, June 19th, so in about 2 or 3 weeks, it's changed course. And now it's kind of just circling the coast of Africa, maybe going to the Caribbean, maybe not. But I bring this up because this is really interesting, right? If you look geopolitically, we don't have a great relationship with Iran. Trump put a lot of sanctions on Iran. Israel continues to do kind of spot bombings, I guess it would be. Yeah, usually by plane against Iran. Iran's been trying to build a nuclear bomb for a long time, and then they say they don't, and then we put sanctions on them, and then it's a really ugly political situation with Iran. And Iran has said publicly, one, they want to wipe Israel off the map, so maybe reason we should side with Israel, not Iran. But two, they've really had this interest, this vested interest in having some type of foothold in the Americas. Obviously, North America, that's probably not going to work out. I don't think Canada is going to align with Iran sometime. But South America, whether you look back to the 80s with Grenada or Panama, or you look where we are today with Venezuela, every decade or so, there seems to be a failed state in Central or South America. And it would make sense for Iran either giving cheap oil to Venezuela or sending a warship like this, for some reasons that we don't know, over to Iran to help them with some type of command and control, or help their economy, or help their military keep down the rebellions and the revolutions that seem to be springing up there every couple of weeks. It's just very interesting that there's always these international politics at play. And again, I don't have anything particularly interesting to say about this. This is not my area of expertise, but it does remind me that when, myself included, many of us Americans spout off about something on social media of like, why didn't Trump do this? Why didn't Biden do that? Oh, he looked like an idiot saying this. Why do we have this policy? Why were there $200 million in the COVID bill that went to the Ukraine to build this up, to act as a buffer state with Russia? Just, there is so much stuff going on geopolitically, right? I would guess if you're one of our 2 listeners who have gotten this far, you probably have not heard about this Iranian warship that's going to Venezuela. And maybe you're not even particularly well informed about what's going on in Venezuela. But it is interesting to me. Like, I really try to be informed. I really try to consume a lot of information. And every day I just realize as I get older how much it is that I don't know. And so I would just say, kind of as a cautionary tale, if this story is interesting to you or the Venezuela story is interesting to you, just remember when you post on social media or you start fighting with somebody in the comment section of the LA Times, or you start insulting Trump or Biden or insert any other politician here or there, just remember, like, we probably don't know as much as we think we know, right? And there's probably a dozen people in the government somewhere monitoring just this situation, saying like, ooh, what could happen? Let's war game this out. Venezuela and Iran do become closer allies. Iran sends a warship to Venezuela. Why might they be doing this? What other public policy, what other commentary, the G7 conference just ended. What other policy at the G7 conference might want to be talking about? What sidebars does Biden need to have with Merkel, right? Or what is the stance that Biden has to take with Putin so that he doesn't align with Iran to have a foothold in Venezuela, which is, by modern travel standards, kind of just a hop, skip, and a jump away from California or Florida. So it's just, I just want people to be cognizant of like how much we don't know and how much is working behind the scenes. And yeah, it's fun to criticize politicians. I love posting memes about stupid Trump or stupid Biden, or I kind of hate them all. But just know that there's probably a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that keep us safe at night that we just don't even know about. So my last story, and this comes to us from Austin, Texas, is Matthew McConaughey thinking about running for governor of Texas. And I'll tell you, ever since Matthew McConaughey was in, I was going to say Fast Times at Ridgemont Highs, Dazed and Confused, I always thought like, oh, that's kind of an actor that I bet you would be fun to grab a beer with. When you see like certain actors or you see their interviews, you're like, I bet that guy's kind of a pompous jerk. I've always had this feeling, and I have no evidence to this, nor do I have any evidence to the contrary. I've always felt like Matthew McConaughey's probably a pretty cool dude who you want to grab a beer with. And then I've seen some of his interviews recently. Not surprising if he had this thought process of like becoming a politician or running for governor. I've seen him on a whole lot of podcasts, like the Jordan Peterson podcast. He's just been making the rounds. Ryan Holiday, the guy that's written a bunch of books on stoicism. Ryan Holiday is an amazing author, by the way. If you haven't read any of his books, please do. So I've seen him making the rounds on all these podcasts and talking a little bit more about his political opinions and philosophy, a little bit more about his religious faith, things that he's learned in life. He published a book about a year ago called Green Lights that I read, and it was kind of interesting because it was quasi-autobiographical, but it was really him taking out all the journals. Apparently he's a big journaler, taking out all the journals since way before he was even famous, and kind of going through those and parsing out some of the lessons that he believes in, some of the core values he believes in, some of the lessons that has helped him get to certain places. And his thought is like, in his life, he's really used, I'll call them core values, even though he didn't, these lessons in his journals, these core values, these thought processes to just keep getting through green lights, right? And like, he's like, you can look at my career and it's just been kind of one strategically placed point of luck after another, right? He talks about it's like I just hit all the green lights in a row. So it was a really interesting book. I thought it was pretty insightful. It gave you a little bit more about him and kind of, like I said, quasi autobiographical, but talking about it through his decisions and the things that are important to him and the things that he holds dear. And so he's thinking about running for governor. Not surprising. Ted Cruz, senator out of Texas, chimed in and said, yeah, he's a charming movie star. I'm sure he's a good guy, but maybe we should have somebody that knows a little bit more about government running for office in the state of Texas. And I got to tell you, this was always the danger of Republicans getting on board with Trump, because there is a lot more famous people in America who lean left or far left or far, 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 far left than there is people that lean right or are libertarians or self-proclaimed Republicans. Now, I tend to believe, based on a few of the interviews I've seen with Matthew McConaughey, he's probably a little bit more conservative, definitely more religious, and probably a little bit more libertarian than virtually everybody in Hollywood. But Republicans, this is your fault. Morons. When you got behind somebody who could win the presidency based on name recognition and based on the fact that he had been on, The Apprentice and people knew his name and stayed in his hotels, the danger was always that you were going to have Kim Kardashian as the next governor of California, or that you were going to have Alec Baldwin running for president, right? And these are probably people that have big name recognition and can get elected, probably don't have the same core values of those of you on the right side of the political spectrum. So again, I have no strong personal opinion about Matthew McConaughey as a future politician. I do think it wouldn't be a horrible idea for a guy who's a self-made millionaire. Let's look up the net worth of Matthew McConaughey. I'm gonna guess 34 million. And one of the things that I actually did like about Trump, to give the devil his due, is that he did have so much personal net worth and value. It was very clear that he didn't care who he pissed off. Now, a lot of people could say that's a really bad thing because that created the leader of the free world being allowed to put himself in the situation where he'd go on Twitter and say really rude things and not set the right tone for the country. But it did feel like throughout his entire presidency that he wasn't kind of selling out to special interests, because what does he care? He's already probably a multi-hundred millionaire, if not a billionaire, with his assets. So what was Matthew McConaughey's net worth?
150
million? I was way off. Dude, still banking that money from Dazed and Confused, or is it invested wisely? So I kind of like the idea of somebody who's not doesn't have to sell out to political interest groups or special interest groups. He can kind of trade off the fact that he can invest some of his own money as a campaign. He can run off of brand recognition. He'll get a ton of media without having to pay for it. And so, a lot of those special interest groups that come into play when you're early on your political rise, he can probably sidestep a lot of that and then just think about good policy. Now, I would be interested in him, coming out either as a Republican or him being a little bit more open in Texas about maybe his more progressive views due to the fact that he was kind of born and raised as an adult in this Hollywood, California atmosphere. Again, I don't know anything about his political beliefs other than some of the stuff that he shared in his book and on podcasts, but it'll be interesting to see if he can be authentic with who he would be politically and either alienate the left side of the spectrum in Hollywood if he comes out as a libertarian or a pretty hard right side conservative, or he would have to alienate and win over the conservative voters in Texas if he comes out and says, no, I'm more of a progressive and I think that's the right vision for Texas. So it should be interesting. But if there's somebody to do it from the movie star arena, maybe he's the guy to do it. But, to all my Republican friends, be careful what you wish for, because, you got 4 years of Trump based on his name recognition. But how are you going to feel if the next president of the United States is Whoopi Goldberg or Alec Baldwin, who could just not be more far to the left, right? That's the scary part about this becoming like a zeitgeist popularity contest. The presidency's always been a popularity contest, but at least we were picking from people that had some governmental experience and some people that had the opportunity to be statesmen and stateswomen. But now we've opened it up to everybody. So be careful what you ask for. All right, 45 minutes. Scott Groves on the Edge podcast. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, all the things to do, like click the little subscribe button, hit the notification button, join our Facebook group or our locals.com group where you can interact with other people from the On the Edge podcast community. And we love you lots. Really appreciate you sticking around and listening to this. If you leave a comment, that also helps the algorithm. Hit the like button. That really helps as well. And wherever you listen to this, we appreciate you. Thank you so much.